Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, we're setting foot on an island whose green fields and grey skies have been shaped by more than 8,000 years of human stubbornness. Ireland, a place where you can pass from a medieval abbey to a Viking street to a Georgian square, all before lunch, and where history isn't so much remembered as it is constantly tripped over. We're going to take a slow walk through its story, from the first hunters who followed the retreating ice, to farmers building tombs with more care than their own homes, to Vikings who came for plunder but stayed for the weather. We'll watch castles rise, flags change, rebellions flare, and famines empty entire valleys, each chapter leaving its mark and none entirely gone. Before we shoulder our pack and start this journey, do me one small favour. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you listen to these in bed, consider using a pair of wireless sleep earbuds for enhanced immersion. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed for side sleepers. I've linked my favourite pair in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Ireland today can be read almost like a book, provided you know which lines to follow. From the air, the landscape is a patchwork of greens stitched by hedgerows and pale stone walls. Weather drifts overhead in slow succession. Blue sky, a smear of grey, a brief spill of rain. Sheep graze along roads scarcely wide enough for a car, their wool scented with grass and sea salt. Villages rise from the folds of hills in clusters of brightly painted shop fronts, while in the cities Georgian terraces face glass-fronted cafes where a milk steamer hisses against the sound of a busker's guitar. History here is not simply present, it's unavoidable. A farmer's pasture might be interrupted by the low ring of an Iron Age fort. A filling station might share its forecourt with the arch of a medieval abbey, its stones now hosting moss instead of monks. Street names recall saints, rebels, and battles long blurred in the public memory. This is not a place where the past has been tidied into museums. It remains in fields, walls, and language, refusing to be buried. Ireland's story is not a straight line from past to present, but a looping, interwoven narrative. To understand how we arrived at this island, vibrant, modern, and yet visibly ancient, we must walk back across millennia to a time when the island was fresh from ice and utterly human-free. When the last ice age began its retreat around 10,000 years ago, Ireland was still locked in the slow thaw of a landscape reshaping itself. Glaciers had scoured the hills and gouged deep valleys, leaving behind the jagged outlines of mountains and the countless lakes that still dot the countryside. The air was cooler than today, the forests still tentative in their spread, and much of the ground was raw, exposed soil. At first, there were no people here at all. The animals moved in before us, herds of red deer, wild boar rooting through the undergrowth, great flocks of waterfowl following the seasonal rhythms of the wetlands. Between Ireland and the rest of what we now call Britain, the sea had not yet fully claimed its territory. A low-lying plain connected the islands to the continent, allowing both humans and animals to make the journey on foot. But by about 8000 BCE, the sea was rising, the land bridge narrowing, and the first small groups of hunter-gatherers had crossed over, whether by that shrinking strip of earth or in skin-covered boats that hugged the coastlines. They arrived in a place still recovering from its long deep freeze, where the smell of pine and birch mixed with the salt of the sea, and the sound of human voices was a new intrusion. Life for these Mesolithic pioneers was simple in its essentials but complex in its demands. Survival depended on an intimate knowledge of the land and its moods. They moved often, travelling light, following the pull of the seasons. Along the coasts and river mouths, they cast nets or fashioned fish traps from woven branches, waiting for the tide to deliver its catch. In the forests, they tracked deer with a patience born of necessity, following hoofprints through mud and frost, listening for the faint crack of a twig. Foraging filled the gaps between hunts, berries, nuts, edible roots, and the occasional lucky find of honey. Everything useful was gathered. Flint for tools, reeds for weaving, skins for warmth. Their shelters were temporary affairs, light frameworks of wood covered in hides or thatch, enough to keep out the rain for a few weeks or months before they moved on. There were no permanent villages, only a pattern of seasonal camps returning to the same promising spots year after year. In this world, one learned to read the signs, the migration of birds, the blooming of plants, the movement of the tides, because failure to do so meant hunger, and hunger came quickly. While they left few permanent structures, these first inhabitants left behind something more enduring in the form of their tools and refuse. Middens, ancient rubbish heaps of shells and bones, still mark some of their favourite coastal haunts. Stone axes, flint blades, and delicate microliths, small enough to be set into wooden shafts, tell us that their craftsmanship was precise and efficient. The absence of large stone buildings in this period is not due to any lack of skill, but to their way of life. Mobility was more important than monuments. The land itself was their shelter, its rivers their roads, its forests their larders. If they had any thought of legacy, it was not in stone, but in the survival of their families from one season to the next. Around 4000 BCE, however, something fundamental shifted. The people who began arriving in Ireland in this Neolithic period brought with them a way of life that would root them, quite literally, to the soil. Farming was the great turning point. Domesticated crops such as wheat and barley appeared in the fields, along with sheep, cattle, and goats grazing in enclosed pastures. Clearing land became an urgent task, and forests were felled not just for shelter or firewood, but to make way for crops. The rhythm of life began to follow the demands of planting and harvest, rather than the migrations of game. Villages took shape, with houses of timber and wattle and daub that could stand for years rather than weeks. Pottery appeared in everyday use, heavy and breakable, but invaluable for storing surplus grain or milk. With farming came new possibilities, more stable food supplies, the ability to support larger communities, but also new vulnerabilities. A bad harvest could not be outrun the way a poor hunting season could. One was tied to the fate of the fields. But permanence also allowed for something else, the investment of time and labour into works that would outlast their builders. Across Ireland, the Neolithic people began constructing stone monuments of a scale and ambition unmatched for millennia. Megalithic tombs appeared on hilltops and in valleys, their massive stones quarried, shaped, and transported without the benefit of the wheel or metal tools. The most famous of these is Newgrange, a passage tomb in the Boyne Valley, dating to around 3200 BCE, older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and constructed with a precision that still impresses modern engineers. From the outside, it appears as a great mound ringed by curbstones, carved with spirals and geometric patterns. Inside, a narrow stone passage leads to a central chamber, its corbelled roof rising like the inside of an upturned basket. On the winter solstice, the rising sun shines directly through the entrance and down the passage, illuminating the chamber for a few minutes in a golden light. A feat of astronomical alignment achieved without written records or modern instruments. Similar care was lavished on other sites, from the dolmens of Pool na Brony in the Burin, where a great flat capstone rests improbably on slender uprights, to the stone circles and alignments scattered across the island. What is striking is not merely the scale of these works, but the sheer amount of labour they demanded from communities whose daily survival was far from guaranteed. It suggests that the people who built them held strong beliefs about the afterlife, the cycles of the sun, or the honouring of ancestors. Beliefs worth diverting a significant portion of their energy into manifesting in stone. It also suggests that, even in prehistory, human priorities were not always purely practical. One cannot help but notice that these tombs and monuments are often constructed with more care and durability than the houses the living occupied. The homes were modest, impermanent structures that rotted away within decades, while the tombs were designed to endure for thousands of years. In other words, they made better housing for the dead than for themselves. A set of priorities that remains puzzling, though perhaps not entirely alien to any society that has ever built a palace for a ruler while its labourers lived in shacks. This emphasis on monumental construction also hints at an organised social structure capable of directing such efforts. Moving and setting stones weighing several tons requires cooperation, planning, and some degree of leadership, whether persuasive or coercive. While we cannot know the precise nature of Neolithic authority in Ireland, the existence of these monuments speaks to communities capable of pooling resources for a collective goal. It also suggests that these early farmers saw themselves not just as individuals, but as part of a lineage, that their identity was tied to the land and to the memory of those who had come before. The Neolithic period also left behind a legacy in art and craftsmanship. The carvings on stones at Newgrange and other passage tombs display a range of motifs, spirals, lozenges, zigzags, whose meanings remain uncertain but whose execution shows a sophisticated aesthetic sense. Pottery from the period is decorated with incised or impressed patterns, suggesting that beauty and symbolism mattered in daily life, as well as in death. Tools evolved to suit agricultural needs: polished stone axes for felling trees, grinding stones for processing grain, and larger storage vessels for preserving food over the winter. In daily life, these early farmers lived in small clusters of houses, each with a central hearth. The surrounding fields were enclosed by low banks or wooden fences to keep animals from straying. Beyond the fields lay common grazing land and patches of woodland that provided timber, berries, and wild game. The diet was more varied than one might assume. Cereals, milk, meat, fish, and foraged plants all found their way to the table, or rather, the communal pot over the fire. Yet life was still precarious. Illness, injury, and poor weather could quickly upset the balance of survival. Communities were small enough that the loss of a few individuals could be felt keenly, whether in the fields at harvest or in the hauling of stones for a new tomb. By the later Neolithic, the Irish landscape was visibly altered by human hands. Forests had been cleared in many regions, replaced by a mosaic of fields and grazing land. Pathways connected settlements and ceremonial sites, worn into the earth by centuries of travel. The stone monuments stood as fixed points in this landscape, part sacred site, part social gathering place, part statement of permanence in a world where so much else was fragile. These works were not built for the living alone, but as markers for generations yet unborn, tying them to both place and ancestry. In the archaeological record, the shift from Mesolithic to Neolithic marks one of the most significant transformations in Ireland's history, a change in how people related to the land, to each other, and to the concept of time itself. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived in the immediacy of the season. The Neolithic farmers looked forward to harvests and backward to ancestors, anchoring themselves in both directions. It was a new way of being, one that allowed for the accumulation of traditions, possessions, and the kind of long-term projects that still dot the landscape today. But farming and tomb building were only the opening act. A far-reaching cultural wave was already rolling toward Ireland, bringing new language, myth, and a society that would define much of what followed. By around 500 BCE, the island that had been shaped by thousands of years of farming, stoneworking, and ancestral ritual began to absorb a new current of influence from beyond its shores. The changes did not come all at once, nor with the kind of sudden displacement that sometimes defines invasions in history. Instead, the arrival of Celtic language and culture was gradual, unfolding over generations as people, ideas, and objects crossed the sea from mainland Europe and Britain. These new arrivals, or in some cases, the existing inhabitants adopting new ways, brought with them a linguistic and cultural framework that would endure for centuries. The language they spoke, the art they made, the myths they carried, and the social structures they maintained would all leave deep imprints on Irish life. So much so that the echo of this period can still be heard in the modern Irish language and in traditions that persisted long after their origins were forgotten. The island became a mosaic of small semi-independent kingdoms known as Tuatha. Each Tuath was a political and territorial unit, made up of extended families and allied clans, and presided over by a chieftain whose authority depended as much on personal reputation and negotiation as on inherited right. These kingdoms were not vast. Some could be crossed on foot in less than a day. Their size was dictated by practical limits, the reach of a chieftain's influence, the capacity to raise warriors, and the ability to enforce laws within the boundaries. Alliances and rivalries between Tuatha were constantly in motion, sometimes sealed by marriage, sometimes shattered by insult or dispute over cattle, land, or honour. While there was no centralised state in the modern sense, there was a shared cultural framework that made it possible for these scattered communities to recognise one another as part of the same civilization. At the heart of Celtic society in Ireland was a rich oral tradition, and within it the figure of the Druid loomed large. Druids were not merely religious functionaries, they were scholars, judges, poets, and keepers of collective memory. In a world without writing, at least in the early centuries of Celtic influence, knowledge was stored in the minds of those trained to recall it. Religious rites, genealogies, law codes, historical narratives, and the complex web of myth were preserved and transmitted through formal recitation. The training required to master these arts could take years, and the authority of a druid rested not on political power, but on the depth of their learning. They served as mediators between the gods and the people, as interpreters of omens, and as advisors to kings, often wielding more subtle influence than the warriors who stood at the chieftain's side. The religion of this period was deeply entwined with the natural world. Sacred groves, rivers, and hilltops were considered places of power, and seasonal festivals marked the turning of the year. Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad punctuated the agricultural calendar, blending the rhythms of farming with rites that honoured deities and ancestors. Sacrifice of animals, goods, and occasionally humans was part of the religious landscape, though the details are obscured by time and by later accounts written by outsiders. What is clear is that religion was not a separate sphere, but an integrated part of everyday life. The boundaries between the sacred and the ordinary were fluid. A market day could double as a ritual gathering, and a cattle raid might carry not just economic, but spiritual implications. The artistry of Celtic Ireland expressed itself in both practical and ceremonial forms. Metalworkers produced objects of striking beauty and technical skill, from delicate gold torques to elaborately decorated bronze cauldrons. Weapons were not only functional, but embellished with intricate designs, turning swords and spearheads into statements of prestige, as well as tools of war. Stone carving too flourished, often in the form of standing stones marked with swirling motifs that echoed the patterns of earlier Neolithic art, but carried their own symbolic language. These designs were not purely decorative. They were part of a shared visual culture, that could signal allegiance, status, or spiritual belief. Even everyday objects bore traces of this artistry. The curve of a brooch pin, the incised lines on a drinking vessel, suggesting a society in which beauty and symbolism were valued alongside function. Social life in the Tuath was governed by a legal system remarkable for both its complexity and its reliance on human memory. The Brehon laws, as they came to be known, covered matters ranging from land rights and inheritance to marriage contracts, injury compensation, and the obligations between host and guest. These laws were not written down in the earliest centuries. Instead, they were committed to memory by trained legal specialists known as brehons. A brehon's reputation depended on their ability to recall vast amounts of precedent and to apply it judiciously to the case at hand. It was a system that worked admirably well, until, of course, the man who carried the entire legal code in his head died unexpectedly, at which point the Tuath might find itself in urgent need of a replacement before disputes over pasture land turned into swordplay. That this system endured for centuries is a testament to the value placed on continuity, trust, and the spoken word in Celtic society. Economically, the Tuath was sustained by mixed farming, with cattle as the primary measure of wealth. Cattle were not only a source of meat, milk, and hides, but also a form of currency, used in the payment of fines, dowries, and tribute. Raiding for cattle was a common practice, both a means of enriching one's own herd and of demonstrating martial prowess. Land was held collectively within kin groups, and its use was subject to negotiation and reallocation over time. The interdependence of agriculture and livestock shaped the social calendar. Planting, harvesting, calving, and slaughter each had their season, and festivals often coincided with these agricultural milestones. The political life of the Tuath was a constant balancing act between ambition and pragmatism. A chieftain might seek to expand his influence through alliance, marriage, or conquest, but his position was never entirely secure. Leadership was not strictly hereditary. While certain families produced generations of rulers, a candidate still had to be deemed acceptable by the leading families of the Tuath. This meant that a capable and charismatic leader could rise to prominence, but it also meant that a careless or unpopular ruler could find himself replaced. Warfare between Tuatha was frequent but generally limited in scope. Battles were often small-scale affairs, more about honour and resource control than outright annihilation. Nonetheless, the threat of violence was a constant undercurrent, and the ability to defend one's territory was a crucial measure of legitimacy. The role of the poet, or Filid, was another distinctive feature of this society. The Filid were trained in the composition and recitation of verse, and their duties included praising patrons, commemorating victories, and preserving genealogies. In a culture where reputation was currency, the words of a skilled poet could enhance or diminish a leader's standing in ways that might endure for generations. Satire, in particular, was a weapon to be feared. A well-crafted verse could shame a chieftain or expose a flaw, and the fear of such public censure was sometimes enough to influence behaviour. This intertwining of art and politics created a cultural environment in which language itself was a tool of power. Religion, law, art, and politics were thus woven into a single fabric, each thread reinforcing the others. The chieftain might host a great feast, not only to display his wealth and generosity, but to affirm his alliances, honour the gods, and provide a stage for poets and druids to reinforce his legitimacy. Disputes might be settled in the same setting, with the Bresson delivering a judgment that drew on centuries of precedent, witnessed by the assembled community. In this way, the social order was maintained through a blend of ritual, negotiation, and shared cultural values, all underpinned by a collective memory that reached back beyond living recollection. The landscape of Celtic Ireland was as much a part of its social and spiritual life as the people themselves. Hills, rivers, and forests were not merely physical features, but points of connection to myth and ancestry. Certain sites became focal points for gatherings, whether for trade, ceremony, or the settling of disputes. These were places where the different tuatha might meet under a temporary truce, where goods and stories were exchanged, and where the bonds between communities were renewed. Over time, these meeting places acquired layers of meaning, becoming not just geographical locations, but anchors of identity. By the closing centuries of the first millennium BCE, Celtic culture had become deeply rooted in Ireland. The language, social structures, and artistic traditions were firmly established, and the island's tapestry of tuatha formed a resilient, if sometimes fractious, network of communities. It was a society that valued continuity, but was not immune to change, one that balanced local autonomy with a shared sense of belonging to a wider cultural world. Its people lived by the land, by their word, and by the intricate dance of alliances and rivalries that defined their political landscape. Into this intricate web of tribes and traditions came a new idea from the East, one that would transform Ireland's art, learning, and even its sense of time itself. By the early 5th century CE, the island of the Tuatha had already been shaped by centuries of Celtic language, law, and lore. Its poets still wove genealogies from memory. Druids presided over seasonal rituals, and the Brehon laws governed life with their intricate network of rights and obligations. Yet in this era of chieftains and sacred groves, a new faith began to take root, one that promised not just a different set of gods, but an entirely new relationship between people, time, and the divine. The spread of Christianity in Ireland is often distilled into the figure of Saint Patrick, a man whose biography has been overlaid with centuries of story until it is difficult to separate fact from embellishment. What seems certain is that Patrick was not Irish by birth, but a Romano-British youth kidnapped into slavery and brought to Ireland, who later escaped and returned as a missionary. In his own writings, among the earliest surviving texts from Ireland, Patrick comes across as earnest, self-effacing, and determined, a man who believed himself called to serve in the very land where he had once been a captive. The Ireland Patrick encountered was not a blank slate waiting for conversion. It was a land where spiritual authority was already respected, where complex oral traditions existed, and where leaders were accustomed to weighing the counsel of learned advisors. The introduction of Christianity was therefore as much a process of negotiation as of confrontation. Patrick and other missionaries worked by converting chieftains, whose acceptance of the new faith often brought their followers with them. Pagan festivals and sacred sites were reinterpreted rather than erased. Wells and springs that had once been dedicated to local deities became holy wells under the protection of saints, while seasonal gatherings were folded into the Christian calendar. This pragmatic approach allowed Christianity to spread with remarkable speed, adapting itself to the rhythms of Irish society, even as it slowly altered them. Over the next 2 centuries, Ireland became a land of monasteries, from the great centres like Clonmacnoise and Kells to smaller, more remote communities tucked into valleys or perched on rocky headlands. Monastic settlements multiplied across the island. These were not simply places for quiet contemplation, though prayer and the chanting of psalms filled much of the day, but complex institutions that combined religious devotion with practical and intellectual labour. Monasteries became centres of learning, preserving not only Christian scripture, but also elements of the older Irish tradition, recorded now for the first time in writing. They served as schools, training new generations of monks and scribes, as workshops, where metalwork and manuscript illumination reached astonishing levels of artistry, and as hubs of trade, their networks extending across the Irish Sea and into continental Europe. The monks' work as scribes produced some of Ireland's most enduring treasures. On calfskin parchment, they copied not only the Gospels, but also commentaries, liturgical texts, and works of classical learning brought from abroad. The act of copying was a devotional exercise, but it was also an art form. In manuscripts like the Book of Kells, text and image intertwine so completely that the page becomes a single, intricate composition. Letters sprout from one another in curling vines, animals twist into geometric knots. Human figures emerge from interlacing patterns that seem designed as much to astonish as to instruct. The colours, derived from painstakingly prepared pigments, some imported from distant lands, still catch the light more than 1,000 years later. Such works were not intended for everyday reading. They were statements of faith and of the monastery's prestige, visual sermons meant to inspire awe. Monastic communities also preserved and adapted the Brehon laws, creating written records of what had once been held only in memory. In doing so, they blended the Christian moral framework with older legal traditions, shaping a uniquely Irish synthesis of law and religion. Monks became trusted record keepers and, in many cases, treasurers, managing the wealth of both the church and secular patrons. Gold and silver objects, jewelled reliquaries, ornate chalices, and precious manuscripts accumulated in these centres, making them both spiritually and materially rich. It was this combination, the role of monks as both bankers and librarians of their age, that made their institutions so attractive to the less devout but equally attentive eyes of raiders. By the late 8th century, the first longships began to appear off the Irish coast. At first they came and went quickly, their crews testing the waters, literally and figuratively, for what they could take and how much resistance they might meet. When they found the monasteries, the raiders discovered targets that were both well-stocked and poorly defended. The wealth stored in precious metalwork, reliquaries, and imported goods could be carried away easily, while the monks themselves were often valuable as slaves. Viking attacks became a recurring nightmare for monastic communities, a dark silhouette on the water, the sudden rush of armed men, the smoke of burning roofs, and the clatter of boots in cloisters where silence had once been kept. These raids could be devastating, scattering communities, destroying libraries, and forcing survivors to rebuild in more defensible locations. Yet the Vikings were drawn back again and again, suggesting that the monasteries, for all their vulnerability, remained worth the risk. The pattern was often cyclical, a raid, a period of rebuilding, another raid. Some monasteries invested in fortifications or relocated to islands and headlands that offered a natural defence. Others paid tribute in the hope of buying peace, though such arrangements were seldom permanent. The resilience of these communities is striking. Again and again, they return to their work of copying manuscripts, crafting liturgical vessels, and tending to their fields, as if the interruption were merely an unpleasant seasonal hazard rather than a recurring threat. Despite the violence, the monastic network endured, and even in the shadow of Viking sails, Ireland's reputation as a centre of Christian learning spread abroad. Irish monks travelled to Britain and continental Europe, founding monasteries and bringing with them the distinctive, insular style of manuscript illumination and metalwork. Figures like Columbanus became famous for their missionary journeys, and Irish scholarship left its mark on the wider Christian world. At home, the monasteries continued to serve as anchors of both faith and culture, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost, and ensuring that, even in turbulent times, the written word remained at the heart of Irish intellectual life. This era also saw the intertwining of monastic and secular authority. Kings and chieftains endowed monasteries with land and protection, seeking in return not only spiritual favour, but also the prestige of being associated with a respected religious house. Monasteries became important players in the politics of the Tuatha, their abbots sometimes wielding influence equal to or greater than that of secular lords. In some cases, abbots came from the same ruling families as kings, blurring the lines between spiritual and temporal leadership. The church in Ireland thus developed in a pattern distinct from that on the continent, less centralised and more intertwined with local power structures. Daily life within the monastery combined strict routine with the practicalities of self-sufficiency. Monks rose before dawn for prayer, broke their fast with bread and ale, and then set to their allotted tasks, tending the fields, copying manuscripts, teaching novices, repairing buildings. Meals were plain but nourishing, drawn from the monastery's own gardens and livestock. The hours were marked by the ringing of bells, calling the community together for the cycle of services that structured the day. The rhythm was one of discipline and repetition, a life that required patience, humility, and a certain indifference to discomfort. In winter, the stone buildings could be bitterly cold, and the work of copying in unheated scriptoria demanded both endurance and dexterity. Yet for those drawn to it, monastic life offered a clear purpose and a place within a community devoted to both God and the preservation of knowledge. The artistic and intellectual achievements of this period were all the more remarkable for having been produced in an environment so often under threat. That so many manuscripts, metalworks, and stone crosses survived at all is a testament to the resilience of the communities that created them. Even when raided, burned, or scattered, they rebuilt as though the work itself were a form of defiance, a statement that the life of the mind and the spirit could not be entirely plundered. The illuminated pages of a gospel book, the interlaced patterns on a high cross, the careful recording of lore and genealogy all serve to anchor the community against the uncertainty of the wider world. As the 9th century unfolded, Viking raids grew bolder, sometimes striking deep inland along rivers and lakes. Yet this was also the period in which the raiders began to shift from pure plunder towards settlement and trade, a change that would have profound consequences for Ireland's towns and economy. Yet not all visitors came merely to pillage. Some stayed, built towns, and left their mark in the shape of Ireland's first real cities. Eventually, the Vikings, or Norsemen as they were known to themselves, began to see in Ireland more than a collection of poorly defended monasteries and scattered chieftains. They recognised a landscape rich in resources, dotted with sheltered inlets, and positioned in the middle of the sea routes that linked Scandinavia, Britain, and continental Europe. If it had been worth crossing stormy seas to plunder its treasures, it was worth considering what might be gained by staying. And so, in the year 841 CE, the Norse established a permanent, fortified settlement at a tidal pool along the River Liffey, a place that would come to be known as Dyflin, Dublin. The location was well chosen. The Liffey's tidal basin provided a natural harbour, deep enough to shelter longships and close enough to the sea for quick access to the Irish Sea and beyond. From here, the Norse could strike inland via the river or follow the coast to other settlements. The site's defensibility was enhanced by the construction of an earthen bank and timber palisade, enclosing the new town and protecting both its inhabitants and their goods. In its earliest days, Dublin was as much a military camp as a trading post, a place where ships could be repaired, crews rested, and loot stored before being shipped back to Scandinavia or exchanged for goods. But the Norse were more than warriors. They were also traders, craftsmen, and shipwrights of remarkable skill. As Dublin, and other coastal settlements like Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick developed, they became nodes in a growing network of commerce. Silver, furs, timber and amber came from the north. Wine, glassware and fine cloth arrived from the south. Irish goods, wool, hides, salted meat and even slaves moved outwards, feeding the Norse appetite for both necessities and luxuries. This was not a one-sided exchange. Local chieftains, even those who had once fought the Norse, found it profitable to trade with them, and over time, economic necessity proved a more effective diplomat than the sword. In these towns, the soundscape was unlike anything the rural Tuatha had known. The rhythmic hammering of blacksmiths, the rasp of saws on ship timbers, and the chatter of multiple languages filled the air. Norse carpenters and shipwrights applied their craft not only to longships, but to the construction of sturdy timber houses, workshops, and market halls. Markets thrived within the protective walls, selling goods brought in from both land and sea, coins, some minted locally, others imported, circulated alongside barter, a small but significant step toward a more monetised economy. Dublin's mint would eventually produce silver pennies stamped with designs that reflected both Norse and Gaelic influences, a tangible symbol of the blending cultures. The Norse influence extended beyond the practical and into the social fabric of Ireland. Intermarriage between Norse settlers and the local Gaelic population was common, especially among the merchant and warrior classes. Children of mixed heritage often inherited the languages, traditions, and networks of both parents, becoming bridges between communities that had once been at odds. Over time, a distinct Hiberno-Norse identity emerged, particularly in the urban centres, where Norse and Gaelic customs overlapped in everything, from dress to diet. Names, too, began to cross boundaries. A Gaelic chieftain might take a Norse wife and name his son after her father, while Norse traders adopted Irish names for use in dealings inland. Cultural blending could also be seen in art and craftsmanship. The intricate knotwork of Gaelic metalwork found new expression in the form of Norse brooches, weapon hilts, and jewellery. Wood carving, a highly developed art in Scandinavia, left its mark on Irish ecclesiastical furniture and decorative panels. Even the layout of some settlements reflected a merging of traditions, with Norse-style longhouses standing alongside structures built in the round, more typical of Gaelic architecture. Such fusions were not the product of some conscious policy of integration, but rather the natural result of people living, working, and marrying within the same walls. Religious life, however, presented more of a contrast. The Norse brought with them the pantheon of Odin, Thor, and Freya, along with the rituals and seasonal festivals of their homeland. For a time, pagan worship continued openly in the towns, even as Christian monasteries still operated in the countryside. But by the 10th and 11th centuries, conversion to Christianity had become widespread among the Norse in Ireland, driven partly by political alliances with Gaelic Christian rulers and partly by the practicalities of integration. Churches were built within the towns, and the once pagan settlers began commissioning stone crosses and other Christian monuments, often in styles that retained traces of their ancestral art. The political role of the Norse settlements was complex. While their towns were often viewed with suspicion by rural chieftains, they also served as valuable allies in the shifting landscape of Irish politics. Norse leaders might be hired as mercenaries in local disputes, their fleets offering a decisive advantage in raids or sieges. Conversely, Gaelic kings sometimes attacked the towns to assert dominance, seize wealth, or disrupt trade. Alliances could shift quickly. Today's trading partner might be tomorrow's target, and vice versa. The fortunes of the towns rose and fell with the skill of their leaders, the stability of their trade routes, and their ability to navigate the turbulent politics of both the Norse world and Gaelic Ireland. Dublin in particular became a centre not only of trade, but of political ambition. By the 10th century, its kings were asserting influence far beyond the city's walls, at times claiming authority over other Norse towns, and even over parts of the surrounding countryside. Figures like Sitrick Silkbeard, who ruled Dublin for much of the early 11th century, cultivated both Norse and Gaelic alliances, commissioning churches and minting coins, while also maintaining the city's role as a key link in the maritime trade network. Under such rulers, Dublin's status as a hybrid city, at once Irish and Scandinavian, became firmly established. The Norse settlements also reshaped Ireland's connections to the wider world. From Dublin, ships could reach the Hebrides, Orkney and Shetland, linking Ireland to the far reaches of the Norse world. Trade extended into the Baltic and down the rivers of Eastern Europe, where Norse merchants connected with the markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate. Goods, ideas and people flowed through these channels, bringing to Ireland not just wealth but new influences in art, technology and even cuisine. The presence of imported goods, silk, spices and glassware in archaeological finds from Norse towns speaks to the cosmopolitan nature of these settlements, which would have been remarkable in an otherwise largely rural and self-sufficient Ireland. For all this complexity, the Norse presence in Ireland was never universally welcomed. Raids on monasteries and inland settlements continued sporadically, particularly in the earlier phases of settlement, and the memory of these attacks lingered in Irish annals. Yet the simple fact that the Norse towns endured, and in some cases thrived, is a testament to their ability to adapt and integrate. Their story is not one of straightforward conquest, but of a gradual entangling of interests, a process in which trade, marriage, and shared defence against common enemies sometimes outweighed old grievances. It is tempting to imagine the first Norse settlers arriving in Dublin with the single-minded intention of plunder, only to find themselves, a generation later, with Irish in-laws, Christian churches, and markets selling goods from half a world away. If so, it may be said that they came for plunder but stayed for the weather, which says rather a lot about Norway. Whatever their original motivations, the outcome was a set of towns that would become enduring features of the Irish landscape, places where different worlds met and remade each other in ways neither had fully planned. Over the following centuries, the Norse settlements would continue to play their part in the island's shifting political chessboard. They were alternately besieged and protected, raided and enriched, courted and betrayed. Their harbours remained vital to trade, their marketplaces essential to the exchange of goods and information, and their hybrid culture a reminder that even in an age of frequent violence, cooperation and coexistence could emerge from unlikely beginnings. Centuries later, a different wave of newcomers would arrive, armed not with longships but with royal charters and a mandate from across the Irish Sea. By the middle of the 12th century, Ireland's political landscape was still dominated by the patchwork of Gaelic kingdoms and the Norse towns that had by now settled into a rhythm of trade, intermarriage, and occasional warfare with their neighbours. Alliances shifted constantly, and rivalries were kept alive by disputed borders, inheritance quarrels, and the occasional opportunistic raid. It was a system that, for all its instability, was understood by those who lived within it. The English crown, however, would soon be presented with an opportunity to insert itself into this framework, and once invited, it would be in no hurry to leave. The opening came in 1169, when Diarmait mac Murchada, the deposed King of Leinster, sought help to regain his throne. Expelled by a coalition of rival Irish kings, Diarmait turned to King Henry II of England for aid. Henry granted him permission to recruit forces from among his subjects, which Diarmait did with remarkable success, enlisting a band of Anglo-Norman knights led by Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow. In return for military support, Diarmait promised Strongbow the hand of his daughter Oif, and with it, the succession to Leinster. The arrangement was a mixture of desperation and ambition, but it set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of Irish history. The initial Anglo-Norman landings in 1169 were modest in scale, but devastating in effect. Armed with chainmail, mounted knights, and a disciplined approach to siege warfare, the invaders quickly outmatched the forces sent against them. Their style of fighting, combining cavalry charges with archery and the methodical reduction of fortifications, was new to many of the Gaelic lords, whose armies relied more heavily on swift infantry raids and ambushes. Towns and strongholds fell with alarming speed, and by 1171, Strongbow had taken Dublin, establishing it as his base of operations. Diarmait was restored to his throne, but his death shortly afterwards left Strongbow in possession of Leinster, an outcome that brought Henry II himself to Ireland to ensure that this new power in the Irish Sea would remain loyal to the crown. Henry's arrival marked the first time an English king had set foot on Irish soil. He came with an impressive force, determined to assert royal authority over both his Norman vassals and the local Irish rulers. His strategy was as much political as military. Some Irish kings submitted voluntarily, recognising the advantages of alliance with the English crown, while others were coerced. Henry established the beginnings of a feudal structure in the areas under his control, granting lands to his followers in return for service and loyalty. This was a sharp departure from the Gaelic system, in which land was held collectively within kin groups and redistributed according to custom rather than hereditary right. Under feudalism, land became a commodity tied to personal allegiance, and the king, or his appointed lord, was its ultimate owner. To secure their holdings, the Normans built castles, and not the simple wooden ring forts familiar to the Irish. These were stone fortresses, often raised on earthen mounds, with high curtain walls, towers, and gatehouses that dominated the surrounding landscape. Motte and Bailey designs appeared first, followed by more elaborate keeps as the occupation became more permanent. The castles served not only as defensive structures, but as symbols of authority, projecting the power of their owners over the countryside. Villages and markets often developed in their shadow, encouraged by the protection the walls offered and the economic activity generated by the garrison. The Norman settlers brought with them other elements of their administrative and cultural world. New agricultural techniques, market towns with charters, and the concept of boroughs with defined rights and privileges. They introduced stone churches in the Romanesque style, some richly decorated with carved capitals and elaborate doorways. Roads were improved to facilitate the movement of troops and goods between strongholds, and the framework of manorial courts and sheriffs began to appear. In short, the Anglo-Norman presence did not merely impose itself militarily, but began reshaping the infrastructure and governance of the regions it controlled. And yet the Norman conquest of Ireland was never complete. Beyond the areas of direct control, the so-called Pale centred on Dublin and its immediate hinterland, Gaelic lords continued to rule according to their own customs. In the marches between Norman and Gaelic territories, power was negotiated daily, with alliances, truces and marriages bridging the cultural divide. Over time, many of the Norman lords began to adapt to their new environment in ways the English crown found deeply unsettling. They adopted aspects of Gaelic law, took Irish wives, learned the language, and even styled themselves in the manner of Gaelic chieftains. The process, later referred to as going native, was less an act of rebellion than the natural result of living in close proximity to and interdependence with the local population. From the perspective of the English monarchy, this blending of cultures was a problem. The expectation had been that the Normans would act as agents of English authority, extending and consolidating royal power. Instead, some were becoming semi-independent rulers in their own right, their loyalties as much to their Irish kin and neighbours as to the crown. Efforts to enforce English customs and law met with limited success outside the Pale, and the lines between conqueror and local grew increasingly blurred. The English crown's constant disappointment lay not in the military achievements of its invaders, but in their evident enjoyment of Ireland, a place they were meant to control, not to embrace. Meanwhile, Gaelic resilience was not simply a matter of cultural assimilation, it was also military. The Irish lords adapted their tactics to meet the new threat, avoiding pitched battles against heavily armoured knights and instead relying on guerrilla warfare, ambushes, raids and scorched earth tactics designed to deny the Normans easy supplies. Knowledge of the terrain was a formidable advantage, and campaigns into Gaelic territory could become costly in both lives and resources. The Normans might win control of a region, only to lose it again within a season when their forces were withdrawn or distracted elsewhere. Religious life in the Anglo-Norman territories reflected the broader European church, but also accommodated local traditions. Monasteries that had survived from earlier centuries were rebuilt or re-endowed, sometimes adopting continental monastic rules. New orders, such as the Cistercians, established abbeys that became centres of both spiritual and economic life, managing extensive estates. These foundations often benefited from the patronage of Norman lords, eager to display their piety and secure their legacies, though such patronage also served as a means of consolidating their control over the surrounding lands. Trade expanded under the Anglo-Normans, with towns like Dublin, Waterford and Limerick growing as ports for the export of Irish wool, hides and salted fish. Imports included wine from France, fine cloth from Flanders, and luxury goods for the elite households. The presence of a coinage system, supported by royal mints, further integrated Ireland into the economic orbit of England and the continent. Markets and fairs multiplied, providing opportunities for both local and long-distance merchants. In many towns, the population was a mix of Gaelic Irish, Norse Gaels, Anglo-Normans, and English settlers, each contributing to the complex social tapestry. The balance of power in Ireland during the medieval period was therefore never static. Periods of relative peace alternated with outbreaks of conflict, whether between rival Gaelic kingdoms, between Gaelic and Norman forces, or among the Norman lords themselves. The Crown in England attempted to tighten its grip through legislation, such as the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, which forbade intermarriage with the Irish, the adoption of Irish dress or language, and other forms of cultural integration. In practice, these laws were difficult to enforce beyond the Pale, and many Norman families ignored them entirely. The statutes stand as a testament to the Crown's persistent anxiety about the erosion of English identity among its settlers. Despite the efforts of the English monarchy, the reality on the ground was that Ireland remained a divided land. In the east and south, the Norman presence was strongest, with fortified towns, castles and estates operating under feudal principles. In the west and north, Gaelic lords held sway, maintaining their laws, language and traditions. The frontier zones between these regions were dynamic spaces where cultures mixed, often uneasily, but where practical arrangements allowed for coexistence. In many cases, mutual economic benefit outweighed ideological divisions, and trade moved across these boundaries in both directions. By the late medieval period, the initial momentum of the Norman invasion had slowed, and the political map of Ireland bore little resemblance to the neat conquest imagined in the early years. Some Norman families had become as entrenched in Irish life as any Gaelic dynasty, their fortunes tied to the land in ways that bound them as much to Ireland as to England. Others remained firmly aligned with the crown, particularly those within the Pale, where English law and administration held more consistent sway. The resulting mosaic was complex, unstable, and resistant to simple categorization, a reflection of centuries of adaptation, compromise, and occasional defiance. In time, the English monarchy would tire of half measures and seek to bring all of Ireland firmly under centralised control. During the opening decades of the 16th century, the English crown's grip on Ireland had shrunk to little more than the Pale, a fortified strip around Dublin where English law held sway and royal officials could move without armed escort. Beyond its borders, the authority of Gaelic lords and the descendants of the earlier Norman settlers, many now thoroughly integrated into Irish culture, persisted. The crown's control was largely nominal, and the idea of a unified Ireland under English rule was as distant as it had been centuries earlier. Yet the accession of the Tudor dynasty in England marked the beginning of a more determined effort to change that balance. The Tudors, with their appetite for centralisation and suspicion of divided authority, saw Ireland not as a distant, untidy dependency, but as a potentially dangerous flank, one that might harbour enemies of the crown or serve as a landing ground for foreign powers, eager to challenge English rule. The first half of the 16th century saw an escalation in English involvement, beginning with military campaigns aimed at bringing the more independent Gaelic and Hiberno-Norman lords to heel. These efforts were framed as the reconquest of Ireland, though in truth many of the areas targeted had never been firmly under English control in the first place. The Tudor strategy combined force with diplomacy, offering lords the chance to surrender their lands to the crown and receive them back under English tenure, along with English titles. This policy of surrender and regrant was intended to replace the Gaelic system of landholding with the feudal model, binding the lords more closely to the monarchy. Some accepted, calculating that royal favour was worth the price of adapting to new laws and customs. Others resisted, unwilling to surrender ancestral rights or adopt foreign ways. The growing tension between England and Rome after Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church in the 1530s added a new dimension to the conflict. What had been primarily a struggle over political authority now took on the character of a religious divide. The Reformation in England meant that loyalty to the crown was increasingly associated with adherence to Protestantism, while resistance to English rule often coincided with the defence of Catholicism. In Ireland, the Reformation made little headway among the general population, whose attachment to the Catholic faith was reinforced by the perception that it was also a defence of Irish identity. Thus, the Tudor reconquest became both a political and a confessional project, with the suppression of Gaelic lords bound up in the wider European contest between Protestant and Catholic powers. The military campaigns intensified under Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, whose long reign saw some of the most sustained efforts to subdue Ireland. Elizabeth's government regarded the island as a source of instability and potential rebellion, particularly in the context of Catholic Spain's hostility toward Protestant England. Rebellions by Irish lords, most notably the Desmond rebellions in Munster and the 9 Years' War led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, were met with determined, often brutal suppression. English forces employed scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and livestock to starve rebel forces into submission. Entire regions were depopulated, their inhabitants displaced or dead from famine and disease. The human cost of these campaigns was immense, and the scars they left on the land and its people would endure for generations. With the defeat of the major Gaelic rebellions, the Crown moved to consolidate its control through a deliberate reshaping of the land and its ownership. This was the era of the plantations, large-scale schemes to confiscate land from Irish lords and grant it to settlers from England and Scotland, who were expected to establish loyal Protestant communities. The Ulster plantation, initiated in the early 17th century but rooted in Tudor policy, was the largest and most ambitious of these projects. Following the flight of the Earls in 1607, when leading Gaelic lords left Ireland for continental Europe, vast tracts of Ulster were declared forfeit and redistributed to newcomers. It is worth clarifying that plantation in this context did not involve palm trees or rows of sugarcane. It meant farmland, previously worked and inhabited by local Irish communities, taken and handed to settlers deemed more politically reliable. These plantations were not experiments in exotic agriculture, but in demographic and cultural engineering, the deliberate alteration of a region's population to make it more firmly aligned with the Crown. The incoming settlers were expected to bring with them not only their tools and livestock, but also their language, religion, and loyalty to the English monarchy. The plantations transformed the social and physical landscape of the areas where they took hold. Fortified towns and villages were established, laid out according to planned designs unfamiliar to much of rural Ireland. These settlements often included markets, churches, and schools intended to serve the settler population, with the hope, rarely realised, that they might also draw in the local Irish. In practice, the communities remained largely separate, with religious and cultural divisions reinforcing mutual suspicion. The settlers built houses and farmsteads of stone and timber in the styles of their homelands, while the dispossessed Irish were often pushed onto poorer land or into the margins of the new estates. Feudal tenure replaced Gaelic systems in plantation areas, binding tenants to landlords through written leases and fixed rents. This shift undermined the traditional communal landholding practices of the Irish clans, in which land was allocated according to need and familial ties rather than market value. For those who lost their ancestral lands, the change was not merely economic, but a profound rupture in the social fabric. The dispossession created a class of landless Irish who were often forced into seasonal labour, tenancy under unfavourable terms, or outright vagrancy. Religious policy under the Tudors further deepened the divide. Protestantism was established as the official religion of the realm, and attendance at Anglican services was nominally compulsory. In practice, enforcement in Ireland was inconsistent, and the majority of the population remained Catholic, worshipping in secret or in remote rural chapels. The persistence of Catholicism was seen by English officials as both a religious failing and a political threat, reinforcing the view that the Irish were in need of reform, if not outright replacement. For the Irish, adherence to Catholicism became a marker of resistance as well as faith, linking their religious identity to the defence of their lands and traditions. The Tudor reconquest and the plantation policy were not purely acts of suppression. They were also efforts at integration on terms set entirely by the Crown. English law, language, and customs were introduced into areas brought under control, and some Irish families, who had aligned themselves with the Crown, were able to secure positions within the new order. These families often walked a fine line between their Gaelic heritage and their obligations to the English administration, navigating a world in which loyalty was measured not only by deeds but by visible conformity to the new norms. Economically, the plantations aimed to create a more productive and profitable countryside, integrated into the markets of England and beyond. The settlers brought new farming techniques, introduced crops and livestock breeds, and participated in the growing export trade. Ports in plantation areas became gateways for goods moving in both directions. Raw materials and agricultural produce leaving Ireland, manufactured goods and luxury items arriving from abroad. Yet the prosperity of the settlers stood in sharp contrast to the poverty of many dispossessed Irish, for whom the plantations meant exclusion from the economic benefits they generated. Culturally, the Tudor and early Stuart policies reshaped Ireland in ways that would have lasting consequences. The spread of English as a language of administration and trade was accelerated, even as Irish remained dominant in much of the countryside. The built environment began to reflect English styles in both urban and rural settings, with stone manor houses and fortified bournes, walled enclosures dotting the landscape. The division between the Protestant settler population and the Catholic majority became a defining feature of Irish society, one that would fuel conflicts for centuries to come. Resistance to the plantations took many forms, from armed uprisings to legal challenges, from passive non-cooperation to outright flight. Bands of dispossessed Irish sometimes resorted to raiding plantation settlements, reclaiming cattle, or destroying crops in acts of defiance. These confrontations, combined with the broader tensions of religious difference and political subjugation, ensured that peace in plantation areas was always precarious. The policies of the Tudor reconquest may have succeeded in extending the Crown's reach across the map, but they did so at the cost of sowing deep divisions into the soil itself. By the close of the Tudor period, Ireland had been transformed. The authority of the Gaelic lords was broken or greatly diminished. The church had been reoriented, at least officially, toward Protestantism, and large swathes of land had been reallocated to settlers loyal to the Crown. The map of Ireland no longer reflected the patchwork of medieval kingdoms and semi-independent lordships, but a territory increasingly bound into the framework of the English state. Yet beneath this imposed order, older identities and loyalties persisted, ready to resurface when the moment was right. The 17th century opened in Ireland under the long shadow of the Tudor reconquest and the plantation system that had reconfigured the ownership and use of land across much of the island. The defeat of Gaelic lords in the 9 Years' War at the turn of the century, followed by the flight of the Earls in 1607, had created a vacuum in leadership for large parts of the native Irish population. Into that vacuum stepped the settlers of the plantations, English and Scottish Protestants, who had been granted confiscated land in Ulster and other regions, along with the military and administrative apparatus of the English Crown. Beneath the veneer of imposed order, tension simmered. The divisions between Catholic and Protestant, native and settler, dispossessed and landholder, were not simply social or religious. They were about power, survival, and the memory of what had been taken. These divisions would erupt with devastating force in the decades to come, folding Ireland into the wider storms that swept across the kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The first great upheaval came in 1641 in the form of a rebellion that began in Ulster and spread rapidly across much of the island. Catholic gentry, alarmed by rumours of anti-Catholic legislation from London and emboldened by the political instability in England, launched an uprising aimed at seizing control of key strongholds and forcing concessions from the Crown. At its outset, the rebellion was not intended to drive the English out entirely, but to redress grievances and secure Catholic rights. Yet in the confusion and violence of the early days, attacks on Protestant settlers, both military and civilian, spread panic. Stories of massacres, some exaggerated and others, all too real, circulated widely, fueling a cycle of reprisals. What began as a political gambit quickly escalated into a brutal, sectarian conflict that would claim tens of thousands of lives and displace many more. The rebellion merged into the larger struggle known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, a tangled series of civil wars and political crises that engulfed England, Scotland, and Ireland in the 1640s and early 1650s. In Ireland, the conflict was further complicated by the formation of the Confederate Catholics, a self-declared government based in Kilkenny that sought to unite Catholic Ireland under its own authority while negotiating with both royalist and parliamentarian factions in England. This patchwork of alliances shifted constantly as the situation in Britain evolved, and for a time it seemed possible that the Confederates might secure a degree of autonomy for Ireland within a broader royalist victory. But the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the rise of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth government in England brought a decisive and catastrophic turn. Cromwell's arrival in Ireland in August 1649 was swift, calculated, and uncompromising. Leading a parliamentarian army seasoned by years of war, he came not merely to subdue Ireland, but to punish it for the perceived atrocities committed against Protestants in 1641, and to ensure that it could never again serve as a base for royalist resistance. His campaign began with the infamous siege of Drogheda. When the town refused to surrender, Cromwell's forces stormed it, killing not only the garrison, but many civilians, a massacre he later justified as an act of divine justice. The fall of Wexford shortly afterward followed a similar pattern, with widespread killing and the sacking of the town. These early actions set the tone for a campaign that combined military efficiency with deliberate terror, intended to break resistance through fear as much as through force. Cromwell's army pushed relentlessly through the country, taking fortified towns, burning crops, and destroying the means of subsistence in rebellious areas. The combination of direct military action and scorched earth tactics left swathes of the countryside depopulated and desolate. Famine and disease followed in the wake of the army, killing many more than the sword. Resistance was not extinguished overnight. Irish and royalist forces fought on in the west and south for several years, but the outcome was never in serious doubt. By 1653, organised resistance had collapsed, and the Commonwealth government set about reshaping Ireland in its own image. The settlement that followed was as transformative as it was punitive. Vast tracts of land were confiscated from Catholic owners and redistributed to parliamentarian soldiers, creditors of the English state, and Protestant settlers. The slogan "to hell or to Connaught," whether or not it was ever officially pronounced, captured the reality for many dispossessed Irish landowners who were driven west into poorer, less fertile lands in Connaught, while their former estates were parcelled out to newcomers. Catholic landholding, which had already been reduced by earlier plantations, fell to a fraction of its pre-war level. The social and economic displacement was immense, creating a permanently altered landholding class that would dominate Irish politics and society for generations. Religious policy under Cromwell was equally severe. The public practice of Catholicism was banned, Catholic clergy were persecuted, and efforts were made to impose Protestantism through both law and the presence of Protestant settlers. While outright conversion was rare, the association between Protestantism and political power was reinforced, deepening the sectarian divide. For the Catholic population, religion and cultural identity became even more closely entwined, with adherence to the old faith serving as a form of quiet resistance to the new order. The toll of the 1640s and early 1650s was staggering. Estimates of the population loss vary, but many historians agree that Ireland lost a substantial proportion of its inhabitants through war, famine, and disease during this period, perhaps as much as a quarter or more. Entire communities were wiped out or reduced to scattered remnants, their lands occupied by strangers. Towns that had once been centres of trade and craftsmanship lay in ruins, and the rural economy struggled to recover from the deliberate destruction of crops, livestock, and infrastructure. The psychological impact was equally deep. The memory of Cromwell's campaign lodged itself in the Irish historical consciousness with an enduring bitterness. Cromwell is remembered in Ireland with the same warmth one might reserve for a damp cellar. Unpleasant, unavoidable, and never entirely forgotten. His name became a byword for ruthless oppression, invoked in family stories and folk memory as the embodiment of English cruelty. Whether in the burned-out shells of churches, the abandoned fields, or the new stone houses of the settlers, the evidence of his time in Ireland lingered as a visible and living reminder of the devastation. In the decades after Cromwell's death and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, there was some political reshuffling. Charles II restored lands to certain royalist supporters, and some Catholic landowners were able to regain part of their estates through legal manoeuvres or royal favour. However, the broad pattern of Protestant dominance established under Cromwell remained intact, reinforced by the continued exclusion of Catholics from positions of political power. The monarchy's interest in Ireland was often more about extracting revenue than addressing the grievances of its people, and the memory of the wars ensured that distrust between communities remained high. The later 17th century saw further turbulence, particularly during the reign of James II, whose Catholic faith and attempts at religious toleration alarmed many of his Protestant subjects. Ireland became a central theatre in the Williamite War, 1689 to 1691, fought between the forces of James II and those of William of Orange, who had been invited to take the English throne during the Glorious Revolution. For many Irish Catholics, supporting James was less about loyalty to his person than about the hope that his victory might reverse the land confiscations and legal disabilities imposed over the previous decades. For Protestants, particularly those in the settler communities, William's cause represented the preservation of their property and position. The war culminated in a series of major battles, including the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and the Siege of Limerick in 1691. William's victory sealed the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, confirming the political and economic dominance of the Protestant minority over the Catholic majority. The Treaty of Limerick, which ended the war, promised certain rights to Catholics, but was soon undermined by penal laws that restricted Catholic property ownership, education, and participation in public life. These measures were justified by the Protestant ruling class as necessary for security, but served equally to entrench their own power. By the century's close, the map of power in Ireland had been remade yet again. The Catholic landowning class was a shadow of its former self, its wealth and influence stripped away by successive waves of confiscation. The Protestant ascendancy, composed largely of descendants of English and Scottish settlers, and bolstered by the support of the Crown, dominated the political and economic life of the island. The scars of the 1641 rebellion, Cromwell's campaign, and the Williamite War remained fresh, each episode reinforcing the divisions that had taken root over the previous 100 years. The 18th century opened in Ireland under a political and social order solidified by the turbulence of the previous 100 years. The Protestant ascendancy, the ruling class composed largely of English and Scottish settlers and their descendants, held the levers of power, secured by the outcome of the Williamite War and reinforced by the penal laws that followed. These laws, enacted in stages over the late 17th and early 18th centuries, were designed to ensure that the Catholic majority could never again mount a serious political or military challenge to Protestant dominance. They worked as much by exclusion as by punishment, stripping Catholics of the right to hold public office, bear arms, serve in the military, or vote. Property rights were sharply curtailed. Catholics could not buy land from Protestants, inherit it from them, or lease it for more than 31 years, and land already owned by Catholics had to be divided among all sons rather than passed intact to the eldest, a deliberate attempt to fragment estates and weaken the Catholic gentry. The penal laws extended beyond property and politics into education and religion. Catholic schools were forbidden, and Catholics were barred from teaching, while the training of priests was driven underground or abroad. Public Catholic worship was suppressed, with churches often reduced to simple, unadorned buildings on remote sites, far from the conspicuous spires and bell towers of Protestant churches. While enforcement varied from place to place and decade to decade, the cumulative effect of these laws was to push Catholic influence out of public life almost entirely, relegating it to the private sphere and the scattered networks of local community and parish. This legal framework was not simply a matter of religious bigotry, though there was plenty of that. It was also a calculated political strategy to maintain the wealth, power, and security of the Protestant minority. In the countryside, where the majority of the population lived, these restrictions were felt most keenly. Most Catholics were tenant farmers, working land they could never hope to own, bound by rents that could be raised at the landlord's discretion. The landlords themselves were often absentee, living in Dublin or London and leaving the management of their estates to agents whose primary task was to extract as much revenue as possible. The pressure on tenants was relentless, with little security of tenure and the constant risk of eviction. Agricultural life was subject to the whims of the market, the weather, and the landlord's balance sheet, and the margin between subsistence and ruin could be dangerously narrow. It was in this climate that agrarian unrest began to take organised form. Secret societies emerged in the rural south and west, the most famous of which were the White Boys, named for the white smocks they wore during nighttime raids. Their grievances were varied: high rents, the enclosure of common lands, the imposition of tithes to support the Anglican Church. But their methods shared a pattern of direct action and intimidation. They levelled hedges and fences to restore access to enclosed lands, destroyed the property of landlords or agents they saw as unjust, and posted threatening notices warning offenders to change their ways. These were not random acts of violence, but targeted efforts to enforce a kind of parallel justice in the absence of fair treatment from the law. The White Boys and similar groups were met with harsh repression, their members hunted down, tried and executed, but the conditions that had given rise to them proved stubbornly persistent. While the countryside was marked by poverty and unrest, Dublin in the 18th century developed into a city of striking elegance and ambition. The wealth extracted from Irish agriculture, combined with the consolidation of ascendancy power, funded a wave of building that transformed the capital into one of the architectural jewels of Europe. Georgian Dublin, with its broad streets, graceful squares, and symmetrical facades, projected an image of order and refinement. The great houses of the elite rose in brick and stone, their interiors adorned with plasterwork, carved wood, and imported marble. Public buildings, the Custom House, the Four Courts, the Parliament House, stood as monuments to the authority and taste of the ruling class, their classical lines and imposing porticos proclaiming stability and prosperity. It was easy to admire the fine architecture of Dublin, provided one was not employed in its construction. For the labourers who dug the foundations, hauled the stone, and plastered the ceilings, the grandeur was a source of wages, not comfort. Many of these workers lived in cramped, damp tenements, their proximity to the splendour of the Georgian squares serving only to sharpen the contrast between rich and poor. The city's elegant facades concealed not just parlours and drawing rooms, but also overcrowded rooms, where the urban poor eked out a precarious living as servants, porters, and hawkers. Dublin streets, for all their refinement in the fashionable quarters, were no stranger to beggars, petty crime, and disease. The gulf between the capital and the countryside was not merely a matter of architecture. In Dublin, the Protestant elite gathered in Parliament, clubs and salons, discussing trade, law, and the arts, while in the rural West, smallholders calculated whether their rent could be paid without selling the family cow. The city was linked to the currents of European Enlightenment thought, with societies devoted to science, literature, and philosophy. The countryside was more concerned with the immediate realities of weather, harvest, and the landlord's next demand. Yet both were part of the same political entity, bound together by the structures of the ascendancy and the underlying tensions that those structures maintained. The penal laws ensured that the Catholic majority remained politically marginalised, but they also fostered a sense of shared identity among those excluded from power. Catholicism became not only a religious affiliation, but a marker of cultural belonging and historical continuity, a link to the island that had existed before conquest and plantation. Priests and parish networks played a central role in sustaining community life, providing spiritual guidance and practical assistance in times of hardship. In this way, the very measures designed to weaken Catholic influence often reinforced it within the communities that endured them. By the middle of the century, there were modest signs of change. Economic growth in some sectors, particularly in linen production in Ulster, offered new opportunities for trade and employment. The rise of a Catholic merchant class in certain towns challenged the neat divisions of the penal code, as some Catholics found ways to prosper despite the restrictions. Meanwhile, Enlightenment ideas about liberty, commerce, and governance began to seep into Irish political discourse, influencing both Protestant reformers and Catholic leaders. These ideas, however, did not erase the realities of inequality. For most of the population, life remained constrained by the legal and economic structures of the ascendancy. Tensions between landlords and tenants continued to fuel unrest, with periodic flare-ups of agrarian violence drawing harsh responses from the authorities. The government's reliance on the army to suppress rural protest underscored the absence of effective political channels for grievance. Reform-minded voices within the Protestant elite called for easing some of the penal laws and addressing economic inequities, but such proposals often met with resistance from those who feared any loosening of control. The result was a slow, uneven process of change that did little to address the deeper causes of discontent. Georgian Dublin, in all its splendour, became a symbol of both Ireland's potential and its contradictions. It was a city that could impress foreign visitors with its beauty and culture, yet it was built on a foundation of social division and economic extraction. The Parliament House on College Green hosted debates on trade and taxation, but it represented only a fraction of the Irish people. Catholics had no voice there, and the interests of the rural poor were rarely more than an afterthought. The grandeur of the capital could be taken as proof of Ireland's place in the modern world, yet it was a modernity reserved for the few, its benefits unevenly shared, and its costs borne by those far from its polished streets. As the century drew on, external events began to stir Ireland's political life in new ways. The American Revolution in the 1770s, with its arguments for self-government and the rights of citizens, resonated with the reformers in Ireland, particularly among the Protestant middle class. The relaxation of certain trade restrictions by Britain during the war provided a brief economic boost, and the formation of the volunteer movement, ostensibly a militia to defend against foreign invasion, gave some in Ireland a taste of organised political influence outside the direct control of the crown. Calls for legislative independence grew louder, culminating in the short-lived era of Grattan's Parliament in the 1780s, when the Irish Parliament gained greater autonomy in domestic affairs. Yet for all the talk of reform, the fundamental inequalities remained. The penal laws were eased in stages during the latter part of the century, allowing Catholics to lease land for longer terms and eventually to vote under certain conditions. These changes were significant in symbolic terms, but limited in their immediate impact on the distribution of wealth and power. The rural poor continued to live at the edge of subsistence, and agrarian unrest flared periodically as landlords and tenants clashed over rents, tithes and evictions. The promises of Enlightenment reform were often slow to materialise in the lives of those who needed them most. By the final decade of the 18th century, Ireland was simmering in a way that could no longer be ignored. The century had been marked by the tight grip of the Protestant ascendancy, the penal laws that excluded the Catholic majority from political power, and the grinding reality of rural poverty. Yet ideas travel faster than armies, and across the Atlantic and the English Channel, revolutions had shown that entrenched systems could be toppled. The American Revolution of the 1770s had proved that colonial rule was not unassailable, while the French Revolution of 1789 seemed to promise the wholesale remaking of society. In Ireland, these events stirred imaginations far beyond the walls of Dublin's Parliament House. They inspired pamphlets, clandestine meetings, and the conviction among reformers that a new, more equal political order might be within reach, if only the deeply rooted divisions between Catholics and Protestants could be overcome. The Society of United Irishmen, founded in Belfast in 1791, was born out of this atmosphere of possibility. Initially composed mainly of Presbyterian merchants and professionals frustrated by their own political exclusion under the Anglican-dominated system, it soon expanded its vision to embrace Catholic emancipation and the radical reformation of Parliament. Figures like Theobald Wolfe Tone argued that the divisions between Catholics, Protestants, and dissenters were nothing more than the careful work of those who profited from keeping Ireland divided. If those barriers could be broken down, a united Irish people might stand together for independence. The United Irishmen began openly, advocating reform through legal channels, but the British government's growing alarm at the influence of France and the spread of revolutionary sentiment soon forced them underground. Repression was swift and thorough. The authorities outlawed the society, closed sympathetic newspapers, and infiltrated its ranks with informers. Meetings were broken up, leaders were arrested or forced into hiding, and the threat of martial law hung over much of the countryside. Still, the United Irishmen planned for an armed rising, convinced that only force could unseat British control. In this, they looked to France for help, hoping that a French landing could both supply weapons and draw British forces into a two-front conflict. The French government, keen to undermine Britain, attempted to send a large expeditionary force in 1796. The fleet reached Bantry Bay, but storms scattered it before troops could come ashore. It was a cruel twist of fate. The weather had succeeded where British defences might not have. By 1798, the United Irishmen's leaders knew that the organisation was riddled with informants and that arrests were picking off their most capable organisers. Rather than allow the movement to wither entirely under government pressure, they decided to move ahead with an uprising. The plan was for a coordinated national revolt, but without modern communications and under heavy surveillance, coordination was tenuous at best. The first major outbreak occurred in May in Leinster, with County Wexford becoming the heart of the rebellion. Early rebel victories at Oulart Hill and the taking of Enniscorthy suggested that the British forces could be pushed back, especially when much of the rebel army was armed with little more than pikes and improvised weapons. For a brief time, there was a sense that the dream of an Irish Republic, uniting Catholic and Protestant, might survive its fragile beginnings. That hope proved short-lived. The government responded with overwhelming force, mobilising the army, local militia, and yeomanry. The fighting was brutal, and neither side was innocent of atrocities. The decisive battle came at Vinegar Hill in late June, where a large rebel force was surrounded and scattered. In Ulster, where Presbyterian radicals had once been central to the United Irishmen, the rising faltered quickly under sectarian strain and government crackdowns. The rebellion degenerated into a grim pattern of skirmishes, executions, and retaliations. Civilians suspected of sympathy for the rebels were flogged, burned out of their homes, or summarily killed. French aid did eventually arrive, but far too late to revive the rebellion. In August, a force of just over 1,000 men under General Humbert landed in County Mayo. In a startling victory at Castlebar, they routed a larger British force, sending it fleeing so quickly that the encounter was remembered as the Castlebar Races. Yet the triumph was fleeting. Humbert's advance was halted and crushed at Ballinamuck in September, his troops taken prisoner. A final French attempt in October ended in disaster, and with it went the last hope for foreign intervention. By year's end, the rebellion had been extinguished. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands were dead, rebels, loyalists, and civilians alike, and the countryside was left scarred both physically and psychologically. The vision of a non-sectarian Irish Republic had not survived the realities of war and repression. In many places, old sectarian wounds reopened, leaving Catholics and Protestants wary of the unity the United Irishmen had preached. For the British government, the rebellion was evidence of the danger posed by an Ireland with even partial autonomy, particularly during wartime against France. For Irish radicals, it was a lesson in the risks of rising without overwhelming support, adequate arms, and secure leadership. In the wake of 1798, London turned with renewed urgency to the idea of political union. Ireland at the time still had its own parliament in Dublin, dominated by the Protestant ascendancy and subordinate to the Crown. From the British perspective, that arrangement was no longer tenable. A united legislature in Westminster, it was argued, would bind Ireland more tightly to Britain, prevent future rebellions, and allow for a more coordinated defence against foreign threats. The Act of Union was framed not only as a security measure, but as a vehicle for prosperity, promising Irish commerce access to British markets and holding out the prospect, never quite promised outright, of Catholic emancipation. In Ireland, the proposal met fierce resistance among members of the Dublin Parliament, many of whom saw union as the extinction of their own influence. Yet opposition could be softened with enough persistence and the right inducements. The British government, under Prime Minister William Pitt, embarked on a campaign of persuasion that was not above using the oldest tools of politics: patronage, titles, pensions, and the quiet assurance of future favours. Some MPs were swayed by arguments for stability and economic gain, others were simply bought. In 1800, after a failed attempt the year before, the Irish Parliament passed the Act of Union. On the 1st of January 1801, it came into force, joining Ireland and Britain into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The Irish Parliament was dissolved, and Irish MPs and peers took their seats at Westminster. In theory, Ireland was now an equal partner in the Union. In practice, representation was limited, and power remained firmly concentrated in British hands. The promised economic benefits proved elusive for many, and Catholic emancipation, so often hinted at during the debates, was delayed for decades. Parliament's promises of union benefits were as sincere as a landlord's promise to fix the roof, grandly spoken, fondly repeated, and seldom backed by action. For the Protestant elite aligned with Britain, the Union offered a strengthened link to the imperial centre and a safeguard against the upheavals that had shaken the island in 1798. For much of the Catholic majority, it was simply another chapter in the long history of being ruled from afar, with little say in decisions that shaped their lives. The economic integration with Britain created winners and losers. Industries tied to export markets often prospered, while rural subsistence farmers saw no change in their precarious existence. The political absorption of Ireland into the United Kingdom may have stabilised London's control, but it did not heal the divisions that ran through Irish society. Under the newly minted Union, Ireland entered the 19th century tethered ever more tightly to Britain's political and economic machinery. The early decades were shaped by a slow grind of frustration and reform, the most significant of which came with Catholic emancipation in 1829. For generations, the penal laws had ensured that the majority Catholic population were second-class citizens in their own country, barred from sitting in Parliament, holding many public offices, or even owning certain types of property. The campaign for emancipation, led by Daniel O'Connell, a barrister with the rhetorical precision of a scalpel and the stamina of a man who understood that change in Britain's governance rarely arrived before tea, galvanised Irish politics. O'Connell's monster meetings drew vast crowds, demonstrating that the population could be mobilised without pitchforks and pikes, though not without the implicit suggestion that these could be found if necessary. When the law finally passed, it marked a symbolic victory, even if many structural inequalities remained as solid as the stone walls dividing fields across the countryside. Yet this flicker of political progress was soon overshadowed by a catastrophe of such scale that it remains the defining tragedy of modern Irish history. The Great Famine of 1845–49 was not the first failure of the potato crop, but it was the one from which the country could not recover without shattering. The blight, Phytophthora infestans, an organism as unromantic as its name, blackened leaves, rotted tubers underground, and left entire fields smelling of decay. The potato had become the staple food for millions, not because it was exotic or fashionable, but because it was nutritious, relatively easy to cultivate, and capable of producing high yields on small plots. When it failed year after year, the rural poor, already living on the brink, found themselves without recourse. Hunger turned to starvation, and starvation to death, on a scale that emptied entire villages. The human toll was staggering. Contemporary estimates suggest 1 million died, though the real number is difficult to pin down, partly because many of those who vanished from parish records had slipped quietly onto coffin ships bound for America or Canada. The choice for many was grim: stay and face the slow wasting of famine, or leave for a voyage in which disease and deprivation were often as lethal as any blight. The ports swelled with families carrying what few possessions they could salvage, sometimes no more than a bundle of clothes, a few cooking utensils, and the hope that across the Atlantic no one would care about their accent or their religion so long as they could work. Many never saw Ireland again, and those who survived often found that the New World had its own hierarchies and prejudices. The famine was not solely a natural disaster, and here lay the bitter political memory. Food continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain during the crisis, the product of a landlord-tenant system that prioritised rent and profit over survival. Relief efforts were uneven and often undermined by an ideological reluctance to interfere with market forces, as though hunger could be reasoned with if one simply quoted enough economic theory at it. British officials spoke of not fostering dependency, a neat phrase that sat uneasily alongside the image of starving families breaking into workhouses, grim institutions where conditions were deliberately harsh to discourage applicants. It is no surprise that in Irish collective memory, the famine became as much about abandonment as it was about blight. Potatoes may have failed, but they remained more dependable than most politicians, who could always be relied upon to find an excuse. In the famine's wake, Ireland was a changed country. The population dropped by millions, not only from death and emigration during the crisis, but because the momentum of departure did not slow. Chain migration carried relatives and neighbours overseas for decades, draining communities of their youth and labour. Fields once tilled were left fallow, villages fell into ruin, and the sound of the Irish language, already in decline, retreated further into the western fringes. For those who remained, survival meant adapting to a transformed social and economic landscape, one in which landlords still wielded enormous power, but where the memory of mass suffering had ignited new political urgency. It was in this atmosphere that the land reform movement gained traction. By the latter half of the century, the Land League, spearheaded by Michael Davitt and supported by Charles Stewart Parnell, pushed for the 3 Fs: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. These were not radical in the sense of overthrowing the entire system, but they did represent a direct challenge to the landlord's dominance. Tenant farmers began to resist evictions through boycotts, a tactic named after one particularly unpopular land agent, Captain Charles Boycott, whose social isolation in County Mayo became a textbook example of collective pressure. The movement's strategies combined legal advocacy with grassroots mobilisation, making it increasingly difficult for landlords to operate without at least some concessions. Meanwhile, the rural landscape was still dotted with reminders of the famine. Abandoned cottages, mass graves, and the ghostly outlines of potato ridges in fields no longer cultivated. The trauma persisted in songs, stories, and a quiet mistrust of institutions that claimed to act in the people's best interest. While Dublin saw modest industrial growth and retained its Georgian elegance in certain quarters, much of rural Ireland remained trapped in cycles of poverty. The contrast was stark. In the capital, gas lamps illuminated wide streets and stately facades, while in the countryside, many still lived in one-room cabins with thatched roofs and earthen floors. The famine also left a political legacy that shaped the century's end. Emigrant communities abroad, particularly in the United States, maintained a fierce interest in Irish affairs, funneling money and support back to nationalist causes. Irish-American networks funded political campaigns, armed uprisings, and relief efforts, creating a transatlantic dimension to Ireland's struggle for self-determination. At home, the experience of catastrophic failure under British rule hardened attitudes toward the Union, fueling both constitutional and militant movements. By the 1880s and 1890s, Ireland was a place where political agitation was no longer the preserve of a few radical voices. Parliamentary nationalism, under leaders like Parnell, sought home rule through legislative means, while others looked to more direct action. Cultural revival movements emerged alongside politics, aiming to preserve and promote the Irish language, traditional sports, and literature. These efforts were not merely nostalgic, they were assertions of identity in the face of what many saw as centuries of erosion. The closing decades of the century were marked by a restless energy, a sense that Ireland was at once bound by history and reaching toward a different future. The famine's scars had not healed, but they had become part of the political vocabulary. Land reform legislation, passed in stages, began to shift ownership away from absentee landlords toward tenant proprietors, though not without protracted battles. Emigration continued, but with it came remittances that kept many households afloat, linking the fortunes of rural villages to those of cities like New York, Boston, and Melbourne. Even as Ireland modernised in certain respects, it remained a country of sharp contrasts. The rural poor might still cook over open hearths and draw water from wells, while in Dublin, horse-drawn trams rattled past department stores and theatres. The sense of being governed from a distant capital persisted, as did the tension between those who believed in gradual reform and those who insisted on more immediate, dramatic change. The memory of mass starvation and displacement was never far from these debates, serving as both a warning and a rallying cry. The opening years of the 20th century in Ireland were marked by a growing tension that had been simmering for decades, if not centuries. Constitutional nationalists continued to push for home rule within the United Kingdom, believing that gradual reform could deliver Irish self-government without the need for violent upheaval. But the pace was glacial, and many younger nationalists, frustrated by endless parliamentary delays and political compromises, began to doubt that constitutional means would ever achieve meaningful independence. The Irish Parliamentary Party, dominant for decades, found itself increasingly challenged by cultural nationalists who were reviving the Irish language, celebrating Gaelic sports, and promoting an Ireland distinct from Britain, not only politically, but in identity. This cultural resurgence was more than pageantry. It helped foster a generation that saw Ireland not as a province of Britain, but as a nation waiting to be reclaimed. This shifting mood was sharpened by the ongoing crisis over Home Rule. A third Home Rule Bill had been introduced in 1912, promising limited self-government, but its implementation was repeatedly delayed, most dramatically by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. In Ulster, the prospect of Home Rule provoked fierce opposition from many Protestants who feared being governed by a Catholic majority parliament in Dublin. The Ulster Volunteer Force armed itself, and in response nationalist groups in the south formed the Irish Volunteers to ensure Home Rule would be enacted. The situation was an armed standoff before a shot had even been fired, with both sides convinced they were defending the future of Ireland, though they envisioned very different futures. Then came the Great War. Many nationalists, under the urging of Irish Parliamentary Party leader John Redmond, enlisted to fight for Britain, believing that Irish loyalty in the war would be rewarded with Home Rule afterward. Tens of thousands served on the Western Front, in Gallipoli and across the Empire. But for a smaller, determined faction of Irish Republicans, the war was not a reason to set aside their cause, but an opportunity. With Britain's attention and resources focused elsewhere, they reasoned, a rebellion could be launched at home with greater chance of success. These men and women, members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Irish Volunteers who rejected Redmond's call, and the Socialist Irish Citizen Army, began plotting an armed rising. The result was the Easter Rising of 1916. On Easter Monday, rebels seized key buildings in Dublin, including the General Post Office, and proclaimed an Irish Republic. Their leaders, among them Patrick Pearse and James Connolly, hoped to ignite a nationwide revolt, but the rising remained largely confined to the capital. British forces moved quickly to suppress it, and after nearly a week of shelling and street fighting, the rebels surrendered. Militarily, it was a failure, and in its immediate aftermath, public opinion in Ireland was cool toward the rebels, who had caused destruction and civilian casualties in Dublin. But then the British authorities executed the leaders, 15 in all over the course of a few weeks, and in doing so transformed them into martyrs. The harsh response, including mass arrests and internment, turned the tide of public sentiment. Where the rebels had been seen by many as reckless idealists, They now appeared as men and women who had died for Ireland's freedom. The Rising had not freed Ireland, but it had shifted the political landscape irrevocably. By 1918, as the First World War drew to a close, Irish politics had been upended. Sinn Féin, a nationalist party that had gained prominence after the Rising, swept the general election in Ireland, effectively destroying the old Irish parliamentary party. The Sinn Féin MPs refused to take their seats at Westminster, instead establishing their own assembly in Dublin, the Dáil Éireann, and declaring Irish independence in January 1919. Almost immediately, the War of Independence began, pitting the Irish Republican Army, IRA, against British forces in a guerrilla conflict that was as much about intelligence and ambush as it was about open fighting. The IRA, under leaders like Michael Collins, operated in small mobile units, striking quickly before melting back into the countryside. British forces responded with a mixture of military units and paramilitary police, notably the Black and Tans, whose reputation for reprisals and brutality only hardened Irish resolve. The war was messy, with assassinations, raids and burnings, and civilians often caught in the middle. Collins himself was both a master strategist and an icon of the movement, directing a network of spies and coordinating attacks with precision. Yet for all the IRA's resourcefulness, the British government was determined not to lose Ireland easily, and the violence showed no sign of ending on its own. By late 1921, both sides were weary, and a truce was called to allow for negotiations. The resulting Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December of that year. It granted Ireland Dominion status within the British Empire, similar to Canada as the Irish Free State, but crucially, it required an oath of allegiance to the British Crown and accepted the partition of the island. The 6 northeastern counties of Ulster, with their Protestant majority, remained part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. The treaty split the nationalist movement in two. Collins and others argued it was a pragmatic stepping stone to full independence, while opponents, led by Eamon de Valera, saw it as a betrayal of the Republic declared in 1916. The disagreement turned into outright civil war in 1922, pitting pro-treaty forces against anti-treaty Republicans. The fighting was bitter, with former comrades now on opposite sides of the barricades, and in some ways it was more emotionally devastating than the war against Britain. Collins himself was killed in an ambush in August 1922, becoming yet another figure in the long line of Irish revolutionary martyrs. By mid-1923, the anti-treaty side, exhausted and unable to sustain the conflict, called a ceasefire. The Irish Civil War ended not with a grand reconciliation, but with a weary silence. The new Irish Free State began to function under the treaty's terms, with pro-treaty leaders in government and anti-treaty forces marginalised, though their political legacy would shape the country for decades. The guns had fallen silent, at least for the moment, and the immediate task became not fighting for a country, but building one. The partition of Ireland, however, ensured that the struggle was far from over in a broader sense. Northern Ireland remained firmly under British rule, its politics dominated by Unionists, and the border would become a lasting symbol of division. The new Free State faced economic challenges, political instability, and the lingering wounds of civil war. Yet for the first time in centuries, most of Ireland was governed from Dublin rather than London, an outcome won through a blend of idealism compromise and more bloodshed than anyone had hoped would be necessary. For all the dramatic speeches and heroic imagery of the era, there was also a quieter reality. Independence had been won, but it came at the cost of unity. The men and women who had once fought side by side in pursuit of a free Ireland now found themselves permanently estranged, and the new state bore the marks of that division. Parliament's promises, in the Act of Union a century earlier had indeed proven about as reliable as a landlord's promise to fix the roof, which is to say, not at all, but replacing those promises with self-government had been neither swift nor painless. And yet, despite the bitterness of the preceding decade, the Irish Free State now had the chance, however imperfect, to shape its own destiny. The question was what to do with it. Under the shadow of the Second World War, Ireland charted a path that was uniquely its own, and, as some would have it, uniquely Irish. Officially, the government called it the emergency, which sounded less like a cataclysmic global conflict and more like a polite warning about a small leak in the roof. This understated title suited the national mood, a preference for minding one's own business, keeping the head down, and avoiding unnecessary entanglements in other people's wars. Under Taoiseach Eamon de Valera, the state declared and maintained a policy of neutrality from 1939 to 1945. This was not a simple matter of indifference. It was the product of historical memory, political calculation, and a desire to preserve sovereignty in a world where small nations were often treated as chess pieces. Having only recently emerged from the struggle for independence and a bitter civil war, there was little appetite for another round of sacrifice in someone else's cause, even if that cause was defeating Hitler. Neutrality, however, was not the same as isolation. While Dublin resisted joining either the Allied or Axis camps, the country maintained a balancing act that involved a quiet, unspoken cooperation with Britain and the United States in certain areas, such as sharing weather reports vital to the D-Day landings, while also firmly asserting its right to refuse use of Irish ports and airfields to Allied forces. This was a delicate position to hold, and it occasionally drew the ire of both sides. Winston Churchill, never one to let a grudge go unsaid, expressed considerable frustration at Ireland's stance, especially given its geographical proximity to Britain. Yet de Valera's government held firm, even going so far as to formally offer condolences to the German embassy upon the death of Adolf Hitler, a gesture that baffled and appalled much of the outside world, but which Dublin defended as a matter of diplomatic protocol. For ordinary people, the emergency meant ration books, fuel shortages, and a daily life stripped of many imported luxuries. Coal became scarce and the nation improvised by cutting turf from bogs in vast quantities, a laborious, muddy process that left whole communities smelling faintly of peat smoke. Petrol was rationed to the point that horse-drawn carts made a noticeable comeback on city streets, and bicycles became the most practical form of personal transport. The blackout regulations, intended to prevent any wartime bombers from using Irish cities as navigation aids, plunged towns and villages into a gloom broken only by the dimmest of streetlights and the occasional glow leaking from curtained windows. Though Ireland escaped the large-scale bombing that devastated cities in Britain, there were occasional incidents, whether from navigational errors or unexplained accidents, that reminded citizens how close the war really was. Economically, the war years reinforced Ireland's dependence on its agricultural sector, as trade routes were disrupted and industrial goods became scarce. Farmers found steady demand for their produce, but manufacturing, such as it existed, remained limited. The economy's narrow base would become an even greater liability in the years after the war, when the world returned to peacetime competition. By the late 1940s, the national mood had shifted from relief at having avoided direct involvement in the war to a growing frustration with stagnation. While much of Europe rebuilt at an accelerated pace with the help of the Marshall Plan, Ireland, ineligible for American aid due to its wartime neutrality, plodded forward under its own power. The political atmosphere of mid-century Ireland was marked by conservatism both social and economic. De Valera's vision for the country, articulated in speeches and in the 1937 Constitution, leaned heavily on rural self-sufficiency, traditional Catholic values, and a romanticised vision of the small family-run farm as the heart of Irish life. In practice, this meant a cautious approach to industrialisation, strict censorship of books and films, and a legal system that deferred to the moral authority of the Church in matters ranging from education to healthcare. Divorce was prohibited outright, contraception was restricted to the point of invisibility, and women's roles were firmly anchored in the home by both law and custom. While these policies enjoyed significant support among Conservative voters, they also contributed to a sense that Ireland was drifting ever further behind its European neighbours in terms of social and economic progress. Emigration, long a feature of Irish life, accelerated once again during the 1940s and 1950s as thousands left for Britain, the United States, Canada and Australia in search of work and opportunity. For many rural communities, it became almost a rite of passage. The young men and women who could not secure a future at home saved what they could, bought a ticket and sent letters and remittances back to the families they left behind. While these remittances were a lifeline for many, the long-term cost was a steady drain of youth and talent that the country could ill afford. The cycle became self-perpetuating. Fewer people meant fewer local businesses, which meant fewer jobs, which meant more departures. Still, there were glimmers of modernisation. In the 1950s, policymakers began to accept that self-sufficiency was not, in fact, a substitute for prosperity. Small-scale industrial initiatives took shape, and there was a gradual shift toward attracting foreign investment, a move that would, decades later, transform the Irish economy entirely. But at mid-century, these were tentative steps, and the immediate reality for most citizens remained one of modest means and limited horizons. Culturally, the period saw a mix of continuity and quiet change. The Irish language revival continued to be championed by the state, though often more in official rhetoric than in daily life. Radio Ireland broadcast a carefully curated blend of traditional music, religious programming, and inoffensive entertainment, ensuring that the airwaves would never become too unsettling. Literature and theatre, constrained by censorship boards, operated within narrow bounds, though skilled writers learned to work around these limits with allegory and subtext. In rural parishes, the annual pattern of fairs, markets, and religious festivals provided a familiar rhythm, even as the younger generation increasingly looked abroad for examples of a different life. The conservatism of the age was reinforced by the close relationship between church and state. Catholic bishops wielded considerable influence, and their pronouncements carried weight not only in pulpits, but in government policy. The church's reach extended deep into education, healthcare, and social services, effectively shaping the moral and cultural landscape of the nation. This alignment between political authority and religious leadership created a sense of stability for some, but it also meant that dissenting voices, whether on issues of personal freedom, artistic expression, or political reform, often found little room to be heard. Yet for all its caution and constraint, mid-20th century Ireland was not static. Beneath the surface, economic necessity, demographic change, and exposure to the wider world through emigrant networks were slowly reshaping the national outlook. The post-war generation, raised in the shadow of the emergency, but coming of age in an era of global change, carried with it different expectations for prosperity, for personal liberty, and for Ireland's place in the world. These expectations would, in time, come into sharp conflict with the entrenched political and social order. Humour, as ever, served as a means of coping with the contradictions of the age. Calling the largest armed conflict in human history the emergency was an act of understatement so perfectly pitched that it became part of the national folklore, an example of how Ireland could, with a straight face, diminish the scale of global upheaval to something one might sort out before tea. It was, perhaps, the same instinct that allowed people to navigate the daily inconveniences of rationing, economic stagnation, and restrictive social norms with a kind of weary wit. If life was going to move slowly, one might as well laugh at the pace. By the close of the 1950s, the limitations of the mid-century model were increasingly apparent. The rural ideal had failed to stem the tide of emigration. Economic growth lagged behind much of Europe, and the rigid social framework was beginning to chafe against the realities of a changing world. Politicians and planners faced a choice: continue along the cautious path that had defined the first decades of independence, or risk more ambitious reforms that might pull the country out of its long economic malaise. What they could not yet know was that, as the 1960s dawned, the most pressing challenge to the state's stability would not come from economic policy or international affairs, but from within its own borders, a conflict rooted in history, identity, and sovereignty, and one that would dominate the decades to come. Under the grey, unyielding skies of Northern Ireland in the late 1960s, a storm long in the making broke in earnest. The Troubles, as they came to be called, a name that manages the same level of understatement as referring to the Atlantic Ocean as a bit wet, were not born overnight. The roots stretched deep into history, centuries of colonization, contested land, religious division, and political promises, alternately broken, delayed, or redefined. But in those first years, the spark came from a civil rights movement inspired by events abroad. Marchers demanded equal treatment in housing, jobs, and voting, pointing out, with considerable justification, that Northern Ireland's democratic institutions often resembled a rigged card game in which one side both dealt the hand and owned the table. Peaceful protest, however, soon met with violent reaction, and violence has an unfortunate habit of drawing in more of its own kind. The late 1960s and early 1970s brought what can only be described as a slow-motion collapse into chaos. Street protests gave way to riots, and riots gave way to organised campaigns of violence. On one side stood Republican paramilitaries, like the Provisional HRA, seeking to end British rule in Northern Ireland and unite the island. On the other stood loyalist groups determined to keep Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom at any cost. Between them, and often caught in the crossfire, were ordinary civilians whose greatest political ambition was to live through the week without their windows shattering. The British Army was deployed in 1969, initially seen by some as a stabilising force. This optimism did not survive contact with reality. Soldiers on the streets became part of the problem as much as part of the solution, and the atmosphere grew ever more charged. The violence that followed was not the chaotic, aimless kind. It was grimly methodical, with bombings, shootings, and assassinations carried out in tit-for-tat fashion. Civilian deaths mounted, often as the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though in such a small, tense environment, the wrong place could be defined as almost anywhere. The early 1970s were particularly bloody, with events like Bloody Sunday in 1972, when British soldiers shot dead 14 unarmed civil rights marchers in Derry, searing themselves into public memory and hardening divisions further. Each outrage was followed by retaliation, which in turn provoked more retaliation in a grim loop that defied any easy ending. Daily life in Northern Ireland during these decades became an exercise in endurance. Checkpoints, security searches, and armed patrols were as much part of the landscape as shop fronts and church spires. people adapted in the way that humans often do under pressure. By narrowing their worlds, avoiding certain streets, certain times of day, certain conversations. Businesses operated behind reinforced windows. Pubs quietly checked who came through the door. Families weighed the risk of a trip across town against the prospect of staying safely indoors. For children, armoured vehicles and soldiers were simply part of the scenery, though the tension in the air rarely went unnoticed. Politics, meanwhile, was a complicated theatre of talks, walkouts, agreements, and the inevitable breakdowns. Efforts to broker peace began as early as the 1970s, with the Sunningdale Agreement in 1973 attempting to create a power-sharing executive and cross-border council. It was, in theory, a sensible compromise. In practice, it collapsed within months under the weight of strikes, protests, and mistrust. The years that followed saw more of the same pattern. Ceasefires announced with cautious optimism, then shattered by renewed violence. Every attempt at dialogue seemed to end in an argument over what peace actually meant, which parties were to be included, and whose past crimes could be forgiven in the name of the future. It was, as many observed dryly, the kind of negotiation that managed to create more meetings than progress. Yet amid the darkness, there were small shifts. By the 1980s, fatigue began to set in. The violence had achieved little beyond loss of life, loss of livelihood, and deepening scars. Efforts like the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which gave the Republic of Ireland an advisory role in northern affairs, hinted at the possibility of cooperation, though they were met with predictable fury from unionists. The late 1980s and early 1990s brought secret talks between the British government and Republican representatives, the sort of quiet diplomacy that could never have been openly acknowledged at the time. Gradually, the unthinkable became thinkable, that all sides might sit at the same table without immediately flipping it over. The peace process gained momentum in the mid-1990s, driven by a combination of political will, public exhaustion, and a dawning realization that no military victory was possible. Ceasefires, though fragile, held for longer stretches. Leaders like John Hume of the Social Democratic and Labour Party worked tirelessly to bring the parties together, often acting as intermediaries between bitter rivals. The arrival of US involvement, particularly through Senator George Mitchell, lent new weight to the negotiations. By 1998, the improbable happened. The Good Friday Agreement was signed, establishing a devolved power-sharing government, setting out provisions for disarmament, and acknowledging the legitimacy of both unionist and nationalist aspirations. It was not a perfect settlement. Perhaps it could never be, but it was enough to halt the worst of the violence. Referendums in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland approved the agreement by comfortable margins, a rare instance in which the public mood aligned across the border. In the years that followed, the security presence on the streets gradually diminished. Walls and watchtowers came down, and life began to resemble something more ordinary. Old wounds, of course, did not vanish. Communities remained largely divided, and mistrust lingered. But compared to the decades that had come before, the difference was profound. For those who had lived through the Troubles, the peace was both a relief and an adjustment. Silence could feel uncanny when one was used to the distant thud of explosions or the whine of helicopters. Streets once avoided slowly reopened to foot traffic, and children grew up without assuming that every unattended bag might be dangerous. Political disagreements persisted, often loudly, but they were now more likely to be expressed in debates than in gunfire. And while some former combatants struggled to adapt to a life without their old causes, others found new roles in community work, politics, or the careful tending of cross-community projects. In hindsight, the sheer endurance of the conflict is striking. 30 years is long enough for a child to grow up. for parents to grow old, for entire careers to be lived under the shadow of violence. The Good Friday Agreement did not erase those decades, but it did offer a chance to step out from under that shadow. Even now, its anniversaries are marked with both celebration and reflection, a reminder of what was endured, what was gained, and how easily gains could be lost if complacency sets in. With the ink barely dry on the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, Ireland entered the 21st century with a cautious sense of optimism. Decades of sectarian violence had left scars both visible and invisible, but there was a feeling, not universal, but notable, that the island could begin to imagine a future without daily news of bombings and funerals. The Republic, in particular, was well positioned to capitalise on a rapidly integrating European economy. Having joined the European Economic Community in 1973 and reaped the benefits of membership through increased trade, development funds and political stability. The late 1990s also marked the start of a remarkable economic surge that journalists would soon dub the Celtic Tiger, a term that sounded less like a fiscal descriptor and more like an exotic sports team, but which nonetheless captured the speed and ferocity of Ireland's transformation. Foreign direct investment poured in, with multinational tech and pharmaceutical companies lured by low corporate taxes, a young English-speaking workforce, and access to the EU market. Dublin became a European base for the likes of Google, Microsoft and Pfizer, while once quiet provincial towns saw industrial parks and call centres sprout up. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, not just in the capital, but across the country, as infrastructure projects, housing developments, and glittering new office blocks sprang into being. Wages rose, unemployment plummeted, and people who had grown up with the assumption that their future lay abroad began to consider staying put. The shift from a country of emigration to one of immigration happened so quickly that it caught almost everyone off guard. A reversal so complete it seemed to defy the ingrained narrative of Irish departure. Alongside the boom came a surge in consumer confidence, which in Ireland translated to a willingness, some might say an eagerness, to borrow. Cheap credit fueled a property market frenzy, with house prices soaring to dizzying heights. Dublin apartments were suddenly commanding sums that would have seemed absurd a decade earlier, and rural plots that once hosted sheep were being subdivided for executive homes. For a time it seemed as though the prosperity might be permanent, that the old cycles of poverty and want had been decisively broken. People bought new cars, holidayed in Spain, and discovered a taste for cappuccinos, which had previously been something you read about rather than drank. Politicians, never ones to underplay their own role in good fortune, proclaimed the success of the Irish model to the world, as though it had been the result of careful planning rather than a particularly well-timed convergence of global trends. Then in 2008, the Celtic Tiger collapsed with all the grace of a drunk falling off a bar stool. The global financial crisis exposed the fragility of Ireland's boom, and the property bubble burst in spectacular fashion. Banks found themselves crippled by bad loans. The government issued blanket guarantees that would saddle taxpayers for years, and the unemployment rate surged once again. Emigration returned almost overnight, with young people, many of them highly educated, heading for Australia, Canada, and the UK in search of work. Ghost estates, half-finished housing developments, abandoned mid-construction, became the most visible symbol of the crash, standing in silent testimony to a decade of overconfidence. The sudden reversal was bitter for those who had believed the Celtic Tiger's roar would never fade, and the years that followed were marked by austerity measures, EU, IMF, bailout agreements, and a collective attempt to rebuild without entirely losing faith in the idea of prosperity. Recovery came slowly, aided by the same factors that had driven the earlier boom: foreign investment, a skilled workforce, and EU membership. By the mid-2010s, growth had returned, albeit with a new wariness about the excesses of the past. But if the economy had been through a whiplash-inducing rise and fall, Irish society had quietly undergone changes just as dramatic, and these changes would prove to be some of the most defining features of modern Ireland. For much of the 20th century, the Republic of Ireland had been socially conservative, heavily influenced by the Catholic Church in matters of law and morality. Divorce, for example, had only been legalised in 1995, and by the narrowest of margins in a referendum, while issues like contraception, same-sex relationships, and abortion were subject to some of the strictest restrictions in Europe. Yet in the space of 2 decades, the country moved from this position to passing some of the most progressive social legislation on the continent. The turning point came in part from generational change. Younger voters, less bound by the Church's authority and more exposed to global social movements, began to assert their priorities. In 2015, Ireland became the first country in the world to legalise same-sex marriage by popular vote, a result celebrated with scenes of joy in Dublin Castle's courtyard that were broadcast internationally. Just 3 years later, in 2018, another referendum overturned the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, ending Ireland's near-total ban on abortion. These shifts were not without their opponents, but the margins of victory, especially compared to earlier, razor-thin social votes, made clear that the Republic's cultural centre had moved decisively. Even divorce laws were liberalised further, reducing the waiting period and making the process less onerous, a change that would have been politically unthinkable in earlier decades. The Ireland of the early 21st century also became an immigrant-receiving country in a way that was entirely new to its history. Workers arrived from across the EU, particularly from Eastern Europe after the 2004 enlargement, as well as from Africa and Asia, adding new layers to Irish society. Towns that had once been homogeneous saw the arrival of Polish shops, Nigerian churches, and Filipino community groups. The transition was not without tensions, but it was a profound reversal from the days when Irish identity was shaped in part by the experience of leaving. The humour of the situation was not lost on many. A country that had spent centuries exporting its people now found itself explaining to newcomers the mysteries of Gaelic football and the unpredictability of Irish weather. The 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK added yet another dimension to modern Ireland's position in the world. As the only EU member sharing a land border with the departing UK, the Republic suddenly found itself in a critical negotiating position. The Northern Ireland Protocol, designed to avoid a hard border on the island, became one of the thorniest and most debated aspects of the Brexit process. While politicians in London and Brussels traded statements, many in Ireland noted with a mixture of pragmatism and irony that the country had gone from being peripheral in European affairs to being absolutely central to one of its greatest diplomatic challenges. By the 2020s, Ireland had established itself as a modern, outward-looking nation, balancing its rapid economic development with an awareness of the fragility of that prosperity. Dublin grew into a hub for tech companies, finance and culture, while rural areas adapted to both new opportunities and lingering challenges. Social reforms, immigration, and international engagement gave the Republic a profile far removed from the insular, church-dominated state of the mid-20th century. Yet for all the progress, the past was never entirely absent. The legacies of partition, the memory of famine and emigration, and the enduring complexity of Northern Ireland's politics all ensured that history remained a constant companion to modern life. And that brings us to the end of our long walk through centuries of invasion, rebellion, hunger, and renewal. A landscape where the past is never far below the surface, and the present is always in quiet conversation with it. If you'd like to join me for more of these slow journeys through history's overlooked streets and storm-battered fields, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another chapter you'd like explored. For early access to new episodes, ad-free audio, and to help keep these stories going, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.